I'm Mark Stetson, producer for Mashable, and I am obsessed with fantasy football. For the past 20 years, fantasy football has dominated my falls and half of my winters. And it wasn't until 2020 that I finally asked myself, why? Actually, it was my wife that asked me why, and I couldn't give her a clear answer. So I needed to figure out why I and over 50 million other people spend over a third of their year obsessing over this game. So I asked the people in my life that I trust the most about fantasy football. My brothers and their friends who've been playing fantasy football together since the late 80s.
In some ways, it sort of changed my life. Like, I wasn't really a huge follower of professional sports until fantasy sports came around.
You know, one of my few vices is fantasy sports, but it's not about the money at all. For so many years, we were doing it for free. Like, you know, it was really just about bragging rights.
Yeah, like Joe and Jay, we've been doing this, for 31 years now. Like, it's crazy.
I also asked ESPN senior analyst Matthew Berry, because if you're going to talk to anyone about fantasy football, you go to the best.
2005, I'm a working Hollywood screenwriter, but I was miserable. I realized that the only thing that made me happy was fantasy sports.
Fantasy football is when a group of friends gets together and they draft real players from real teams onto their own fantasy teams. And then they go head to head each week, and then whoever has the most wins at the end of the season wins the league. By the late 1980s, there were only maybe 1 million people playing fantasy football, and of those million were my brothers and their friends.
I'm going to say the year was 1989.
I remember Dad teaching me how to make a spreadsheet. And I used to come to Spanish class, and Burke sat behind me, and I would have these long printouts, what the nightly scoring was.
Naturally, every week of the NFL season that went by took off at least several points on our GPA in that class. But we did run a sound scoring system in our fantasy football league.
I remember that. Like, I remember asking my brothers why they seemed so excited about what looked to me to be like extra math homework. But that's what they had to do in the late 80s and early 90s.
It was really work intensive because, again, no personal computers. There wasn't anything online. So stats were kept by hand. So if you were super into it, like I was, I would get the box scores every morning in the newspaper, and I would calculate by hand how my team was doing. I really enjoyed it, and that was, certainly part of the appeal.
And nowadays, we'll see a play happen on television, and we look at the iPad, and we're getting upset because 5 seconds later, CBS hasn't updated the score, and it's just such a different perspective now.
Growing up, I had always been a little jealous of my brothers, that they had this connection, that they could speak this secret language that I could never understand. So in the year 2000, when I was 16, that's when I started playing. Now, this was a big era for fantasy football, not just because I started playing, but because it had made it onto the internet. Big companies like Yahoo, CBS Sports, ESPN, they started hosting fantasy football leagues for free, which meant that leagues like the ones that my brothers were in were now being hosted entirely online, and all of the stats that they'd been doing by hand were now being done automatically.
The old god of how we used to do fantasy football, it needed to die.
It broadened the scale and the scope of these leagues to a wider audience. So now all of a sudden, it wasn't just, weird. Like, I wasn't like some weird kid doing fantasy football. Now it was like normal. There were starting to be TV shows about it. There were blogs about it.
It was exciting where suddenly, okay, more people can play. And then you'd be like, oh, hey, did you hear? Meatloaf plays. Meatloaf, wow, like a celebrity, somebody you've heard of actually play. Some athlete makes some reference to fantasy sports in a positive way. Peyton Manning was always, very anti it. It's so funny, I ended up doing an episode of Peyton's Places around fantasy football, and I talked to him about that, where he admitted, I used to hate it, and now he plays it with his kids. It's actually amazing.
You watch football now, and it totally caters to the fantasy football community, in the sense that you can't watch more than 5 seconds of a game without either a player statistic appearing on the screen or every statistic of every other game going on. But back then, there's no statistical updates ever.
When I went to college, the idea that you could make a living doing this was unfathomable. I'm somehow able to make a living wearing makeup and talking about fake football on the internet.
then why do we do it?
I've been in the same league now with Joe and God, all these people. We've been in the same league for 17 years. This is like the 17th or 18th year, and I've never won. I want the trophy. There's a part of me secretly, and maybe not so secretly, that like wants that trophy and then will attempt to convince Aaron that it belongs in the living room. Like somehow, like that's what that trophy means to me.
Yes. Nothing else matters. It could be $1,000 plus league. So what? To get the trophy with your name on it, right? And to be able to talk trash when you meet with your buddies, whether it's New York or wherever, and talk about who was the best, who was on top, and who's still terrible, money doesn't matter.
Fantasy brings people together. The fantasy is a driving force in that it's the great equalizer. My very first fantasy football league, the one that started in 1988 in college, is together to this day. I co-own a team with my college roommate. You know, listen, don't want to brag, but I can coach my team myself. I'm good enough, I believe, to coach my own fantasy team. I co-own it with him because it forces my roommate and I to talk once a week.
Jay and I would say, we joke about it all the time. During the football season, we speak multiple times a week. And same thing with Burke, who's been, one of, if not my closest friend since 5th grade. But when the football season's not happening, we probably speak once every couple of weeks. With that,
Jump forward to today, 2020. There are over 45 million people playing fantasy. And I, who have been playing for 20 years, feel like I am no better at it than I was when I was 16 years old. The more that I strategize, the less control it seems that I have, and the more that luck seems to reign supreme. Like, what am I doing spending all day Sunday and Monday night ripping my hair out, living and dying by my fantasy squad? Like, is it all luck? Like, am I the only one that feels this way?
Of course there's luck involved. Players get injured. Like, if you drafted Saquon Barkley this year, are you a bad fantasy manager? No, you get bad luck. Got hurt. I believe there's also obviously a level of skill that goes into player analysis, that goes into assessing situations, that goes into research, that goes into all aspects of fantasy football.
I would say just like anything in life, you have to really prepare yourself to be in a position to get lucky. You have to wrap your head around the fact that you literally have no control over it whatsoever.
I feel like I've come to a very good place with it, where it doesn't drag me down anymore. It doesn't depress me, other than to contemplate how much energy I'm still putting into it. The amount of energy and time spent. Typically, when you put time and energy and effort into something, the more of that you put into something, the better the product is, right? You get your 10,000 hours. Like, I've got my 10,000 hours in fantasy football. Meaningless. Like, it doesn't help me. Like, I'm an outlier of nothing. Like, we're all a bunch of morons. We're trying to predict the future. If we knew how things were going to go, there would be no fantasy football.
I love my brothers. They are my heroes. They are why I started doing fantasy football, so I could connect with them. And the fantasy football season is when I connect with them the most. Now that I speak that language, I feel like I'm part of the club with them, which, to be honest, I think it's what I always just really wanted from them. So now that I have that, I'm now obsessed with the very thing that was the medium of getting me to connect with them in the first place. The obsession with fantasy football can be whittled down to a desire to harness the wind, to tame an untamable beast. It's the white whale that can never be caught, because as soon as you catch it, it shapeshifts and turns into something else.